Indiana Fever vs. Las Vegas Aces. Expert analysis of Indiana's crushing defeat. The Indiana Fever's loss to the Las Vegas Aces wasn't just a defeat, it was a complete dismantling that exposed every crack in their foundation. A'ja Wilson and Jackie Young combined for an absolutely devastating 67 points, systematically destroying Indiana's defensive schemes possession after possession. But the cruelest twist of fate came when Kelsey Mitchell, Indiana's offensive engine and emotional heartbeat, went down with an injury that shattered any remaining hope the Fever had of mounting a comeback. This game revealed the harsh reality of what separates championship contenders from teams still learning to compete at playoff intensity. The A'ja Wilson masterclass that broke Indiana's spirit. A'ja Wilson didn't just dominate Indiana, she put on a basketball clinic that will haunt Fever fans for months. Her 35 points came in every conceivable way, bullying defenders in the post, hitting contested mid-range jumpers, finishing through contact with championship poise, and drawing fouls that put Indiana in impossible foul trouble. Wilson's performance wasn't about lucky bounces or hot shooting, it was pure basketball mastery combined with relentless aggression that Indiana had no answer for. From the opening tip, Wilson attacked with surgical precision. She established deep post position before catches, sealed her defender with perfect timing and body control, and finished with either hand depending on defensive angles. Her footwork was absolutely elite. Quick drop steps that left defenders flat-footed, smooth up-and-unders that created easy baskets, and turnaround jumpers with picture-perfect form. Indiana tried single coverage, double teams, zone defenses. Nothing worked because Wilson read every scheme like she had the playbook in her hands. The most demoralizing aspect was how effortless Wilson made it look. She absorbed contact that would knock lesser players off balance, maintained her composure under physical pressure, and finished through fouls with the confidence of a player who has been in these moments countless times. Indiana's big players couldn't match her strength, their guards couldn't help without leaving shooters open, and their coaching staff had no adjustments that slowed her down. Wilson scored when the Aces needed momentum. She scored when Indiana made runs. She scored in crunch time when games are decided. This wasn't just good basketball. This was championship-level domination. Jackie Young's silent assassination. While Wilson grabbed headlines, Jackie Young's 32 points were equally devastating and perhaps even more demoralizing because of how quietly she destroyed Indiana. Young exploited every defensive lapse, every miscommunication, every moment of fatigue. She attacked closeouts with lightning-quick first steps, hit contested three-pointers when Indiana tried to help on Wilson, and finished at the rim through traffic with acrobatic layups that defied logic. Young's basketball IQ was on full display. She recognized when Indiana's defenders went under screens and punished them with pull-up jumpers. When they fought over screens, she attacked the rim and either scored or drew fouls. Her off-ball movement was exceptional, cutting through defensive gaps at perfect timing, relocating to open spots when attention shifted to Wilson, and always being in position to capitalize on Indiana's mistakes. The Fever's perimeter defenders looked lost trying to track her movements. The devastating pick-and-roll combinations between Young and Wilson were impossible for Indiana to defend. When they trapped Young, she found Wilson rolling to the basket. When they dropped coverage to protect the paint, Young pulled up for mid-range jumpers or threes. When they switched, mismatches were created that the Aces exploited ruthlessly. Indiana's defensive coordinator had no scheme that could simultaneously contain both stars, and that fundamental problem sealed their fate long before the final buzzer. Kelsey Mitchell's injury, the crushing blow that ended all hope. The moment Kelsey Mitchell grabbed her leg and limped to the sideline, you could feel the energy drain from the entire Fever roster. Mitchell wasn't just Indiana's leading scorer, she was their heartbeat, their confidence, their clutch performer in moments when the game hung in the balance. Her injury didn't just remove points from the box score, it removed leadership, fighting spirit, and the one player capable of matching the Aces' stars shot for shot. Before the injury, Mitchell was keeping Indiana competitive despite Wilson and Young's onslaught. She attacked the basket fearlessly, hit contested jumpers with ice in her veins, and provided the vocal leadership that kept her teammates believing they could win. Mitchell's ability to create her own shot took pressure off role players and prevented the Aces from loading up defensively on Indiana's other weapons. When she went down, that entire offensive ecosystem collapsed. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. Indiana's players looked at each other with defeat in their eyes. Their body language changed, shoulders slumped, defensive effort wavered, and offensive execution became tentative and uncertain. Mitchell's absence exposed how dependent the Fever were on her shot creation and leadership. Role players who thrived with Mitchell drawing defensive attention suddenly faced tighter coverage and couldn't deliver. The bench players who came in to replace her production were simply overmatched against the Aces' intensity. Watching Mitchell on the bench, clearly frustrated and unable to help her team, added another layer of heartbreak to Indiana's defeat. She's a warrior who never backs down from challenges, and being forced to watch helplessly as her team struggled without her was torture. The Fever's coaching staff had no plan B that could replace what Mitchell provided, and that coaching failure became painfully obvious as the game spiraled out of control. Indiana's defensive breakdown against unstoppable forces. Indiana's defensive strategy against Wilson was fundamentally flawed from the start. They attempted single coverage with players who lacked the strength, size, and experience to slow down a dominant post player. When single coverage predictably failed, their double teams came from wrong angles, arrived too late, or left dangerous shooters like Young wide open. The Fever's help defense rotated slowly, communication broke down repeatedly, and basic defensive principles were abandoned under pressure. The interior defense was particularly pathetic. Indiana's big players allowed Wilson to establish deep post position without resistance. They didn't body her up before catches, didn't force her to catch the ball further from the basket, and didn't make her work for positioning. Once Wilson caught the ball in her spots, the outcome was predetermined. Indiana's defenders fouled out of desperation, rather than sound defensive technique, putting the Aces on the free throw line and creating foul trouble that limited their best defenders' minutes. Perimeter defense was equally disastrous. The Fever's guards went under screens constantly, giving Young clean looks from three-point range that she converted with regularity. When they tried fighting over screens, Young attacked the space with explosive first steps that collapsed the defense. Closeouts were slow and poorly executed, allowing Aces shooters time to set their feet and rise into comfortable shooting motions. The defensive communication was non-existent, with players confused about assignments, lost on rotations, and pointing fingers instead of helping each other. The transition defense was absolutely atrocious. Indiana failed to get back after missed shots and turnovers, allowing the Aces easy fast break opportunities that resulted in layups and open threes. The Fever's big players jogged back slowly instead of sprinting. Their guards failed to stop the ball at the point of attack, and nobody took pride in getting defensive stops. This lack of defensive urgency and hustle was embarrassing for a team supposedly playing playoff-caliber basketball. Offensive execution failures. Without Mitchell. With Mitchell sidelined, Indiana's offense became predictable, stagnant, and completely ineffective against the Aces' aggressive defense. The Fever reverted to isolation plays and one-on-one scoring attempts that played directly into Las Vegas's defensive strengths. Role players who looked competent with Mitchell creating opportunities suddenly appeared lost and overwhelmed. The ball movement that creates good shots disappeared, replaced by contested jumpers and forced attempts that resulted in low shooting percentages. Indiana's pick-and-roll execution fell apart without Mitchell's decision-making and penetration ability. Ball handlers telegraphed their intentions, allowing Aces defenders to anticipate actions before they developed. The screens were weak and poorly timed, failing to create the separation needed against athletic defenders. When big players rolled to the basket, entry passes were either too slow, off-target, or intercepted by help defenders. The lack of offensive chemistry and rhythm was painful to watch. The three-point shooting strategy was completely misguided. Indiana settled for contested threes instead of working the ball inside out to create better looks. Shooters rushed their attempts without proper balance or footwork, leading to terrible shooting percentages that compounded their offensive struggles. The coaching staff never adjusted the shot selection even as the makes dried up and the deficit grew. This stubborn adherence to a failing strategy showed either incompetence or desperation. Most frustratingly, Indiana abandoned attacking the basket and drawing fouls. They needed to be aggressive, force the Aces into foul trouble, and earn easy points at the free throw line. Instead, they settled for jump shots that kept the Aces' defenders fresh and out of foul trouble. This passive-offensive approach allowed Las Vegas to maintain defensive intensity without consequences, and it cost Indiana any chance of mounting a comeback. Turnover catastrophe and ball security disasters. The Fever's ball handling was careless, undisciplined, and absolutely unacceptable for playoff basketball. Indiana committed unforced turnovers through lazy passes that were easily telegraphed and intercepted. Poor decision-making led to passes into congested areas where multiple defenders waited. The lack of ball protection against pressure resulted in strips and steals that gave the Aces easy transition opportunities. These weren't turnovers caused by great defense, they were self-inflicted wounds that gifted points to an opponent who didn't need help. Live ball turnovers were particularly devastating because they led to Aces fast break opportunities that resulted in highlight reel dunks and easy layups. Each turnover built Las Vegas's momentum and confidence while simultaneously crushing Indiana's morale. The Fever's guards failed to recognize defensive rotations, continuing to force passes even after multiple turnovers should have taught them better. The coaching staff's inability to correct these fundamental mistakes was inexcusable. The turnovers came at the worst possible times. When Indiana made small runs and cut into the lead, a careless turnover would immediately kill momentum and lead to an Aces score. In crunch time, when possessions were precious, Indiana threw the ball away instead of valuing each opportunity. This lack of composure under pressure revealed a team that wasn't ready for playoff intensity despite their regular season success. Rebounding battle lost on effort and toughness. Indiana was completely dominated on the glass. And this wasn't about size or athleticism. It was about effort, desire, and toughness. The Fever's players didn't box out consistently, allowing Aces players to slip behind them for offensive rebounds. Indiana's big players were outworked and out-hustled by Las Vegas's front court, who crashed the offensive glass with reckless abandon while Fever players watched. Defensive rebounding breakdowns gave the Aces multiple second-chance opportunities that often resulted in easy baskets. Indiana's lack of collective effort on defensive glass was inexcusable. Players assumed teammates would get rebounds instead of pursuing every ball with maximum effort. This passive approach to rebounding extended possessions for Las Vegas, who eventually converted on second or third opportunities because Indiana's defense broke down after multiple efforts. The offensive rebounding disparity was equally damaging. Indiana failed to crash their own offensive glass, settling for one shot per possession, while the Aces earned extra opportunities. This lack of offensive rebounding reflected the Fever's overall lack of aggression and toughness. Championship teams pursue every ball like their season depends on it. Indiana played like they expected rebounds to fall into their laps. Bench production collapse under pressure. The Fever's bench was completely outplayed and overwhelmed by the Aces' reserves, and Mitchell's injury made this disparity even more glaring. Indiana's second unit failed to maintain defensive intensity when starters rested, giving up easy baskets and allowing Las Vegas to extend leads. The bench players looked unprepared for playoff intensity, making fundamental errors on both ends and getting exploited in every matchup. Offensively, Indiana's bench provided nothing. They couldn't create their own shots. They missed open looks that starters created for them, and they turned the ball over under pressure. The drop-off in production when starters sat was catastrophic, turning manageable deficits into insurmountable leads. The coaching staff kept ineffective lineups on the floor too long, allowing the Aces to build comfortable cushions that starters couldn't overcome. The lack of reliable bench production put unsustainable pressure on Indiana's starters, who showed obvious fatigue in fourth-quarter moments when games are decided. Fresh legs make difference plays on defense, fight through screens on offense, and execute with precision under pressure. Indiana's starters were exhausted from carrying the load, and their tired mistakes in crunch time sealed the defeat. Fourth quarter, meltdown and mental collapse. Indiana's fourth-quarter performance was an absolute disaster that revealed their lack of mental toughness and championship pedigree. The Fever's offensive sets became stagnant and predictable as the game tightened. They abandoned ball movement and reverted to isolation plays that the Aces defended easily. The coaching staff called terrible plays out of timeouts, resulting in forced shots and turnovers during possessions when they desperately needed baskets. Defensively, Indiana couldn't get critical stops when the game hung in the balance. The Fever's defenders appeared mentally exhausted, making lazy closeouts and failing to contest shots with appropriate urgency. The Aces exploited these defensive lapses, hitting contested shots and drawing fouls that sent them to the free throw line for easy points. Indiana's inability to maintain defensive discipline when it mattered most was the final confirmation that they weren't ready for this level of competition. The body language told the complete story. Indiana's players looked defeated, their shoulders slumped, their communication non-existent, and their effort sporadic. There was no leader stepping up to rally the troops, no veteran presence demanding better effort, no collective toughness that great teams show when adversity strikes. The Fever quit mentally long before the final buzzer, and that lack of competitive spirit was perhaps the most disappointing aspect of this defeat. Free throw differential and aggression gap. The free throw disparity significantly impacted the game's outcome and reflected fundamental differences in how both teams approached offense. The Aces earned trips to the line through aggressive drives, post play, and attacking defenders who were in foul trouble. Wilson and Young attacked with purpose, seeking contact and forcing officials to make calls. Indiana settled for jump shots that don't generate foul calls, showing a lack of aggression that cost them easy points. The Fever's own foul trouble compounded their problems. Key defenders picked up early fouls that limited their minutes and effectiveness. The coaching staff managed foul situations poorly, keeping players with multiple fouls in games during critical runs when they should have been rested. This poor foul management disrupted defensive chemistry and allowed the Aces to attack specific players they knew couldn't afford additional fouls. Indiana needed to force the issue, attack the basket relentlessly, and put the Aces' defenders in foul trouble. Instead, they played passive, settling for contested jumpers that kept Las Vegas's defenders fresh and aggressive. This strategic failure reflected either poor coaching or a team lacking the confidence to attack elite defenders. Either way, the result was the same: easy free throws for the Aces and a point differential that Indiana couldn't overcome. Referee impact and controversial calls. The officiating in this game showed concerning patterns that deserve honest discussion without making excuses for Indiana's poor performance. Several critical calls went against the Fever during momentum-shifting moments, particularly in the second half when they were trying to mount comebacks. Contact that was called fouls on Indiana defenders appeared inconsistent with similar contact that Aces defenders initiated without whistles. The free throw disparity partly reflected the Aces' legitimate aggressive play, but some calls appeared questionable under scrutiny. Indiana's post players were whistled for defensive fouls on plays where similar positioning by Las Vegas defenders went uncalled. Wilson received favorable calls on plays where contact appeared minimal or initiated by her offensive moves. The inconsistency in how physical play was officiated created an uneven playing field that made Indiana's comeback attempts even more difficult. Late-game officiating particularly favored Las Vegas during critical possessions when calls could have gone either way. Indiana's defenders were penalized for contact that seemed less severe than contact the Aces initiated on the defensive end. While the Fever cannot and should not blame officiating entirely for their loss, the inconsistent application of rules made their already difficult task nearly impossible. Playoff officiating should maintain consistent standards regardless of team reputation, home court advantage, or game situation. The most frustrating aspect was how these calls affected Indiana's ability to play physical defense against Wilson and Young. Every time Fever defenders tried to contest shots with appropriate physicality, whistles sent the Aces to the free throw line. This forced Indiana into passive defense that gave Wilson and Young comfortable looks, creating a no-win situation where aggressive defense earned fouls and passive defense allowed easy baskets. Coaching failures and strategic incompetence. Indiana's coaching staff was thoroughly outcoached in every phase of this game. They failed to make necessary defensive adjustments despite overwhelming evidence that their initial game plan wasn't working against Wilson and Young's dominance. The stubborn adherence to defensive schemes that the Aces were exploiting showed either arrogance or inability to adjust on the fly. Timeout usage was terrible, with crucial timeouts wasted early while momentum-shifting runs by Las Vegas went unchecked. The offensive play calling was predictable and easily defended even before Mitchell's injury made it worse. The Aces coaching staff clearly anticipated Indiana's tendencies and positioned their defense to neutralize the Fever's preferred actions. Indiana's coaches failed to counter-adjust, continuing to run plays that resulted in contested shots and turnovers. The lack of creative play design in critical moments was embarrassing for a coaching staff, supposedly prepared for playoff competition. Substitution patterns made no sense. Ineffective players remained in games while more productive options sat on the bench watching their team get demolished. The coaching staff didn't recognize favorable matchups quickly enough, allowing the Aces to maintain advantages throughout the game. When Mitchell went down, there was no backup plan, no adjustments to offensive schemes, no preparation for losing their best player. This lack of contingency planning revealed coaching staff that wasn't truly ready for playoff scenarios. The timeout management was particularly frustrating. Indiana let Las Vegas go on extended runs without calling timeout to stop momentum. When timeouts were finally called, the plays drawn up were terrible, resulting in turnovers or forced shots. Meanwhile, the Aces coaching staff used their timeouts strategically, making adjustments that countered everything Indiana tried. This coaching disparity was as significant as the talent gap on the court. Mental toughness gap and championship mentality. Missing Indiana lacked the mental fortitude to compete with the Aces' championship pedigree, and Mitchell's injury exposed this weakness completely. When adversity struck through bad calls, missed shots, or defensive breakdowns, the Fever visibly deflated rather than fighting back with increased intensity. The body language and communication on the court reflected a team that didn't truly believe they could win against a superior opponent, especially after losing their best player. The Fever's leaders failed to rally their teammates during crucial moments when the game could have been saved. There was insufficient vocal leadership demanding better effort and accountability. Players pointed fingers at each other rather than accepting responsibility for mistakes and moving forward together. This lack of collective mental strength allowed small deficits to balloon into insurmountable leads that crushed their spirits completely. Championship teams respond to injuries and adversity by elevating their game and finding ways to win, despite difficult circumstances. Indiana folded, quit competing with full effort, and accepted defeat long before the final buzzer. This mental weakness was the most damaging revelation because talent can be developed, but championship mentality requires a fundamental change in team culture and individual mindset. The contrast between how the Aces handled pressure versus how Indiana crumbled was striking. Las Vegas stayed poised when Indiana made runs, executed their offense with precision in crunch time, and maintained defensive intensity throughout the game. The Fever panicked under pressure, abandoned their game plan, and made mistake after mistake when composure was most needed. This mental toughness gap cannot be overcome without significant cultural changes and veteran leadership. Path forward requires complete organizational overhaul. For Indiana to ever compete with elite teams like the Aces, fundamental changes are absolutely necessary at every level of the organization. Defensive schemes must prioritize physicality, intelligent double-teaming of dominant post players, and much better communication. Perimeter defenders need intensive training fighting through screens and maintaining defensive positioning under pressure. The entire defensive philosophy needs reimagining, because what they're doing clearly doesn't work against championship-caliber opponents. Offensive execution must emphasize ball movement, screening, and attacking the basket rather than settling for contested jump shots. The Fever need to develop multiple players capable of creating their own shot so they're not completely dependent on Mitchell. Role players must understand their assignments and execute them consistently, regardless of game pressure or adversity. The offensive system needs more creativity, better spacing, and actions that create high-percentage shots instead of forcing difficult attempts. The development of reliable bench production is essential for sustained playoff success. Indiana cannot compete if their second unit gets demolished every time starters rest. Bench players need more playing time during the regular season to develop chemistry and confidence. The coaching staff must identify which reserves can handle playoff pressure and which cannot, then adjust rotations accordingly without loyalty to players who clearly can't perform. Most importantly, the coaching staff must demonstrate greater adaptability and strategic creativity. In-game adjustments should be proactive rather than reactive, anticipating opponent strategies, instead of responding after damage is done. Better timeout management could prevent momentum swings that prove decisive. Substitution patterns need logic and purpose, rather than appearing random and counterproductive. The front office needs to evaluate whether current coaching staff can lead this team to championship contention, or if changes are needed. They must also assess roster construction, identifying which players have championship mentality and which players wilt under pressure. Building a contender requires brutal honesty about strengths and weaknesses, then making difficult decisions to address deficiencies. Mitchell's injury revealed how fragile this team's success truly is. One player going down shouldn't cause complete systemic collapse. The organizational depth and resilience aren't sufficient for championship aspirations. Indiana must build a roster where multiple players can step up when stars are sidelined, where the system creates advantages regardless of personnel, and where mental toughness is ingrained in team culture. This devastating loss to the Aces should serve as a wake-up call that Indiana is nowhere near ready to compete for championships. Wilson and Young's 67-point demolition exposed every weakness. Mitchell's injury revealed the lack of organizational depth. The coaching failures showed strategic deficiencies. The mental collapses demonstrated cultural problems. Until these fundamental issues are addressed with urgency and comprehensive solutions, the Fever will remain pretenders watching true champions like the Aces raise trophies while they wonder what could have been. Settings. Use appropriate media. Use fewer iStock ad word-by-word subtitle. Use a female clear American voice for the narrator. Use YouTube audio library only.